Hello, I'm Storyteller Bob. I hope you enjoyed the last story. I have two more for you this evening. The first one is entitled Going Home. Joe was finally going home. Japan had surrendered and all the troops were coming home from World War II. Of course, Japan would be occupied, just like Germany, but Joe's unit had served in the Pacific Theater ever since the dark days of Guadalcanal and was under strength despite the periodic addition of replacements. Newer, full-strength units were being sent to Japan, and Joe's unit was mustered out a week ago. He swung his heavy duffel bag across his back and climbed onto the interurban train. He waved to old Harry, the conductor, and sat down in the first open seat near the back of the car. He hadn't seen Harry in ages, not since his last furlough, in fact, when he rode the same train home. He couldn't wait to see everyone again, his family, his friends, and especially Betsy. He had missed her most of all. She had waited for him all this time, and written to him twice a week. Of course, mail delivery was sporadic in the Pacific. Sometimes he'd go for 2 months with no mail at all, and then get a bundle of letters all at once. When that happened, he rationed himself the letters. He allowed himself to read only one each day. Betsy's letters meant a lot to him. He knew she loved him, and that was all that mattered. Joe knew the interurban train had 2 local stops to make before it went on to his town, so he settled back in his seat to relax and enjoy the scenery for once. He had thought this day would never come, but now that it was here, he wanted to savor every moment of it. The train eased out of the station and inched across the city, its whistle blowing frequently at the many street crossings. It stopped at the downtown station, where many more passengers boarded, and then continued on toward the second stop. That one was for the city hospital and the main trolley terminal. He allowed himself the luxury of ignoring the people boarding and departing. It felt good not to have to be constantly alert for danger, the mindset that he had grown used to while in combat. He had seen plenty of combat, and now just wanted to put it all behind him. Too many memories, most of them bad. Gut-twisting fear, sudden ambushes, friends getting killed. He'd seen more than enough. Like the time his best friend Al got hit. Joe and Al had been neighbors and had grown up together. When the war came, they had volunteered together, gone through basic together, and shipped out to the Pacific Theater in the same unit. The war moved them island by island across the Pacific for 3 years. They stuck together and survived each new landing until early 1945. At Okinawa, their platoon had suddenly come under heavy fire as they crossed a ridge. Joe was hit by flying shrapnel, but Al took several machine gun rounds in the chest and arms. Joe and another GI had dragged Al to safety as quickly as they could in the firefight that followed. But Joe knew Al was badly hurt. The corpsman said that Al would have to be treated on shipboard and would probably be sent back stateside for convalescence. Joe had only heard from Al once since that day. A brief note saying that Al had survived several surgeries but was battling infection and tropical fevers, and he had lost a lot of weight. Apparently, Al had dictated the note to a hospital volunteer. He had made light of his condition, but Joe sensed that he was not doing very well. Al had always been very confident in everything he did, and in the note he did not sound confident at all. Well, I'll check with his parents when I get home. Surely they will have heard from him too, if he's not already at home ahead of me. We can go fishing, just like old times, and forget the war. Staring out the window, Joe idly noticed that the city had changed while he was away. He saw many large buildings that he didn't remember seeing before. Probably new factories, he guessed, for the war effort. He wondered what they would make now that the war was over. The farm fields he remembered from before were fewer now, and more frequently interrupted by tract houses, roads, and other development. He wondered if he could afford to buy a house now, with the army pay that he had saved. He hoped so. Suddenly the back of his neck tingled like it had when he was in combat, and it snapped him immediately back to the present. He had learned not to ignore his premonitions, as his sergeant had called them. They had saved his life more than once. Was the train in danger? Quickly he scanned the passengers around him and glanced out the windows. He saw nothing amiss and began to inspect the passengers around him more closely. Did someone have a gun? What was it? He found himself studying a passenger sitting alone at the other end of the car. The man looked oddly familiar. He almost looked like Al from the back. Could it really be Al? Joe pondered this for a while, staring at the man. If Al had been sent home, he could be in outpatient treatment at the hospital. The city hospital was the closest large hospital to their hometown, and it was a logical choice. The man was not in uniform, but most combat veterans dressed in civvies nowadays anyway. Only the latecomers still flaunted their uniforms, as if to cover their lack of military experience. Joe stared some more at the man, his scalp still prickling, trying to make up his mind. He didn't want to approach a total stranger by mistake. Then the man turned around in his seat and his eyes stared unblinkingly into Joe's. Holy cow, I think it is Al, but he doesn't look right. His face is so thin and pale. Joe decided that he had to find out. He swung out of his seat, shouldered his bag, and moved up the aisle. He noticed the man's eyes followed him every step of the way. Joe stopped as he drew even with the man. Al, is that you? Yeah, it's me, all right. I wondered if you'd recognize me. Al's voice was scarcely more than a whisper. It sounded weak and distant to Joe. Al slid over on the seat, and Joe sat down. He dropped his bag on the floor between his knees. I almost didn't recognize you. You look so thin. Hospital chow must be pretty lousy, huh? Just like Sergeant Madigan's? At the reference to their former mess sergeant, Al smiled wearily but didn't laugh, as if it would take too much effort. He really seems exhausted, not at all like the way he used to be before he was wounded. When Al didn't respond, Joe continued, So, have you been home yet? Have you seen your folks or Judy? Judy was Al's high school sweetheart and fiancée. They had gotten engaged on Al's last furlough and planned to marry when he returned from the war. Al had talked of little else when he returned from that furlough. Joe knew that Judy had written Al regularly. My mom visited me after the first surgery. They didn't think I'd make it, and they scared Mom half to death telling her. They couldn't get one of the bullets out. Too close to my heart, they said. It got infected somehow, and I was sick for a long time. They kept me in isolation. Then the jungle fever flared up again, and Judy was too scared to come see me, I guess. Maybe she wouldn't even recognize me now. Wow, you've had a rough time. I got your note in early summer. Everyone wanted to know how you were doing. They thought it was great that you were stateside, because they figured that way the Army wouldn't ship you back. They pictured you in a nice clean bed with good chow and a beautiful nurse taking care of you. Guess not, huh? Al was silent for a moment, as if he was trying to remember. I was unconscious for a month or so, from the infection. The doctors called it a coma or something like that. When I woke up from that, they did 2 more surgeries and finally got that bullet out without killing me. Then the fever came back and I was in and out for a long time. It's all a blur to me now. I don't remember what the nurses looked like. Gosh, you must have been in terrible shape not to remember that. So are you going home now? Are they still treating you at the hospital? Nope, they're done. They said they did all they could. I won't be going back to the hospital. I'm going home. Well, that's great. You'll be able to rest better at home anyway. Yeah, I hope so. And when you feel up to it, we can go fishing, just like old times. I can hardly wait. We can go to that pool near the bend in the stream where you caught that monster bass, or the pond out on Carter's farm. If they haven't built a factory over it, how about that? I'd like that. Al closed his eyes and smiled faintly as if remembering. Joe was a bit surprised at this. He had expected that his suggestion would receive an enthusiastic, "Now you're talking, let's go," not the lukewarm response that he got. "It sounds like Al's been through a lot. Better take it slow. We have plenty of time now." The train was slowing as they approached the station. Their street was barely 3 blocks away. Joe was fairly bursting with excitement. Home at last! He stood up and slung his duffel bag over his shoulder, then turned back to Al. "Let's go, buddy. Here, I'll help you." "No, that's okay." Al was still seated and fumbling in his shirt pocket for something. Joe grabbed him by the arm and pulled him upright. Al felt very light and oddly cold for a sunny fall afternoon. Gee, he has lost a lot of weight. Well, give him some time with home cooking. He'll fill out again. "Come on, I'll walk with you. We left together. Now we can come back together. Let's go." "I can't." "Sure you can." Al didn't protest any further as Joe helped him off the train and steered him past the people on the train station platform. Only when they were walking along Oak Street on the other side of the station did he speak again. "Joe?" "What?" "Joe, you gotta promise me 2 things." Joe heard a note of pleading in Al's voice, as if he was afraid his friend would refuse. "Sure, Al, name it." "If anyone asks how I did in the war, tell them I did my best and didn't let our guys down. You'll tell them that, won't you?" "Sure thing. I'll tell them you were as brave as any and braver than most. I'll tell them that everybody in the company respected you. And if they ask how you got hit, I'll tell them that we both got hit in the same ambush. You got it worse because you were point that day. Okay?" "Yeah, thanks, Joe. It means a lot to me." "And what's the other thing?" Al pulled an envelope out of his shirt pocket and handed it to Joe. "I need you to take this letter. Here." Joe took the envelope. "Joe! Joe, you've come home!" Out of nowhere, Betsy was running down the street towards him. Joe grinned from ear to ear and waved the hand holding Al's letter back and forth. Eagerly, he started towards Betsy. Al dropped behind him. Watching Betsy approach him, he only half heard when Al continued, as if from a great distance away. "Take that letter and give it to Judy. Promise me you'll do that, Joe." Betsy was only about 15 yards away as Joe dropped his bag and started towards her. He heard Al's words, but they made no sense to him. "Sure, Al, but why don't you do it? She's only a block away." As Betsy sprang into his arms, he barely heard Al's answer, but he never forgot it. "I can't. I didn't make it, Joe. I'm going home." Still holding Betsy, Joe whirled around. Al was nowhere to be seen. Joe and Betsy stood alone on the street. The back of Joe's neck tingled again as he saw the envelope still clutched in his right hand. True story. Happened to my former father-in-law as he came home from World War II. The second story is entitled Buddy System, about a scuba diving teacher. Buddy System. The first thing I remembered when I regained full consciousness was the doctor shaking his head and saying, "You're lucky to be alive." I was lying on a hospital bed, breathing oxygen through a nasal tube, and feeling very drained. The hospital lights were bright after the gloom of the underwater cave, and the room was warmer than the water had been. My wife sat beside the bed, holding my hand. My friend Grant stood and fidgeted near the doorway. "Whatever persuaded you to dive alone, Randy? You've made hundreds of dives, and you require the buddy system in all of your dive classes. Why didn't you wait for a buddy?" I thought for a minute. It was like I was swimming through murky water again. "I don't know. The thrill of discovery, I guess. I just got careless." It slowly started to come back to me. Grant and I had planned to dive at the sinkhole on the McCarver property near the coast. The limestone of the Florida Peninsula is riddled with caves from earlier ages when the sea level was much lower. Now they are all flooded. Many of them have formed sinkholes as the overlying rock has dissolved and collapsed. Some diving friends of ours had recently begun to explore this underwater cave system. From what they told us, it was interesting, if a bit dangerous. Another diver, Arledge Turlow, known to all of his friends as Frog for his powerful swimming kick, had disappeared and presumably drowned in those caves about 3 years ago. Hence the name Dead Man's Cave. We weren't particularly impressed. We were veteran divers, and it was just another dive for us. We took all the usual precautions. So what happened down there? Did you discover anything worth your life? I closed my eyes, trying to remember better. No. Unfortunately, things started to go bad early in the dive. Sarah, our land coordinator, had to cancel at the last minute. One of my air tanks wouldn't hold any pressure. Probably just a bad fitting, but they were useless until I fixed them. We hammered our safety lines into the rock of the sinkhole with mountain climbing pitons. But one of the three came out right before we dove. The rock was rotten. The other two held, so we dove anyway. Just to the third room, no further, we signed to each other as we made our way into the narrow funnel that led to the caves. We quickly reached the first large room and began to wind our way single file through the narrow passageway toward the second room. Grant was lagging behind, stopping and adjusting his airflow every few yards. Trouble? I signed back to him. He nodded, signing regulator bad, going back for spare tanks. I'll wait, I signed back to him, so back he went. The 10 minutes I waited seemed like forever, and Grant never came back. I wondered what had happened. It wasn't like him to bail on me, and it wasn't that far back to the funnel. He couldn't have made a wrong turn because the cave had no side passages until after the third room. I waited another 5 minutes, and still no Grant. Maybe his spare regulator was bad too, I thought. He had just replaced them both with a new model that he hadn't used before. I really wanted to see that third room today, to see if we could use it as a base for future dives. So I decided to go on alone. Dumb move, I know. Anyway, I continued along the narrow, twisting passage to the second room. It had some unusual rock formations, probably formed when it was a dry cave, and those were interesting to look at. I didn't inspect them too closely because I still wanted to push on to that third room. I swam into the wider tunnel that led to it, gently tugging at the two safety lines every few yards. I wanted Grant to know where I was in case he was finally following me again. This tunnel was larger in diameter than the earlier passageway, but very rough and irregular. Large pointed rocks jutted from both floor and ceiling. They reminded me of teeth. I wondered if they had been stalactites and stalagmites when the cave was dry. Slowly, swimming around and between them, I eventually reached the entrance to the third room. This room was larger, but had no interesting formations. The sandy bottom had been disturbed by earlier divers in the area. As I shone my headlamp at the walls and ceiling of the room, I noticed my lamp was dimmer than before. It was hard to tell. The room had 4 obvious passageways leading deeper, in addition to the one from which I had entered. As I swam past one of them, the water felt a little warmer, and I actually noticed a slight current. Might this passage go all the way to the ocean? I knew I wasn't far from the coast, and that some of the caves nearby did connect with the ocean. If I checked out this passage now, I might be able to tell. I had reached the end of the shorter safety line, so I let it fall to the sand on the floor of the third room. Holding on to the other longer safety line, I proceeded into the passageway. No further than the end of the line, I told myself. I felt the current more strongly now, although the passageway seemed darker and murkier. I followed it until I ran out of safety line, about 4 yards shy of another room that was dimly lit from above. Another sinkhole, perhaps? Dropping the safety line where I could see it, I swam into the murky room ahead. I had only got about 10 yards further when I realized my mistake. A huge tidal surge swept into the room through the opening above, carrying fish, bubbles, sand, and debris with it. All of this material swirled and eddied around me, reducing visibility to almost zero. Another surge swept in, and another, knocking me sideways. The tide must be coming in, I thought. I couldn't see much of anything. I forced myself to stay calm and did an about-face to head back to the passageway. I swam forward about 5 yards in the murky water. Nothing. 5 more yards, still nothing, and then bump into the wall. I felt around the edge for the passageway. Nothing but rocks. I still couldn't see anything but the debris swirling around me, and my headlamp was definitely fading. I moved slowly to the right for about 10 or 15 feet, but my hands felt no gap in the rocky wall. I moved back to the left and began to feel a faint flutter of panic. Finally, my hands found an opening. I groped my way into the passageway and started searching for the safety line on the sandy floor. No luck. I searched from wall to wall and even continued further along, still searching. No safety line. Was it buried by debris? I continued deeper yet along the passageway and around a curve I didn't remember. Suddenly the walls fell away to nothing, and I was in another room. I knew I had gone the wrong way. Now I did start to panic a little bit. I turned back and groped my way back up the passageway. In my haste, I must have gone further from the cave floor than before, because suddenly my air hose snagged on a sharp stalactite-like rock hanging down from the ceiling. When I realized what had happened, I backed off a bit to free it, but I saw that the rock's sharp edge had sliced my hose. To my horror, I saw a steady stream of bubbles pouring from the hose, zooming up past my mask. I tried to clamp it off with my hand, but it didn't help much. I was losing air too fast. I had to find the way out, and quickly. Gripping the leaking hose with one hand, I blundered back into the murky fourth room. Visibility was still almost zero from the tidal debris. I blindly groped to one side of the passage I was leaving and continued around the wall, searching for the correct passage. I finally found another passageway, but it was much smaller than I remembered. That couldn't be it. What was I going to do? I was running out of air. My gauges were low, and my headlamp continued to dim. I continued around the wall in the same direction and found yet another passageway, but the jumbled rocks at its entrance just didn't seem right. As if in a nightmare, I kept going. I found a large passageway in the dark, murky water and pitched into it. Too fast. I ran headfirst into a rock. Stunned, I floated in place for a few seconds to let my head clear. Then I realized I had let go of the leaking hose. I grabbed it and noticed that it wasn't losing air quite as fast. I noticed my pressure tank gauges. One tank was empty and the other was almost empty. I eased further down the passageway, groping in the sand for the safety line. My movements were getting sluggish. I must not have been getting enough oxygen by that time. It almost seemed like I was watching myself from outside my body. I realized that I wasn't going to make it out. Then something touched my arm, once, twice. A diving mask on a dim human outline loomed in front of me, rising to eye level and stopping there. I recoiled in shock and fear. I had thought I was alone, but a hand came up and signed, "Trouble?" I drew closer in the murky water and seized the arm, signing, "Out of air." I stared at the mask, but my headlamp was much too dim by that time to see the face. It must be Gran, I thought. Odd, his headlamp is missing, and he carried a hand light. He signed "Share," and as I numbly watched, his other hand seized his mouthpiece and held it up to my mouth. I took several breaths, and the cobwebs began to clear in my head. I gave him the thumbs up, and he signed, "Follow me, this way." He pointed back the way I had come in. I gripped his arm as he aimed his light ahead of us, and we entered the murky fourth room almost immediately. As we passed the mouthpiece back and forth for the air, he led me across the floor of the room and into another passageway. Grant seemed to be kicking much more strongly than usual. I guess he had to, towing me with one arm and aiming his hand light ahead of us with the other. I didn't realize where we were at first, but gradually the murky water began to clear. We had passed through the third room, and in the glow of his hand light I could see the rocky teeth that I had noticed on the way in, and the safety line on the ground beneath me. Grant to the rescue, I thought. I did wonder how he found his way through that murky fourth room so easily. After all, he'd never seen it before today. Using landmarks on the floor of the room was a pretty slick idea. I should have thought of that. Anyway, Grant led me through the long, twisting passageway back to the third room. He stopped there. "Tired?" I signed, but he shook his head and signed "Decompression." Of course, I had completely forgotten, perhaps from the lack of oxygen, but I had been down a lot longer than I'd planned and would need a decompression stop before re-entering the air. I'm glad he thought of it in time. As we passed his mouthpiece back and forth, I looked around at the walls of the first room, and then upwards into the funnel. Another piton had pulled out, and the safety line lay in a heap on the floor of the room. More rotten rock, I thought, and pointed it out to Grant. He only nodded. Of course, he had seen it before when he went back for his spare tanks. We'll have to find some good rock to anchor our lines if we want to explore this system any further, I thought. Grant timed the decompression stop, and eventually he pointed upward into the funnel. My headlamp was completely dead, but enough light came down the funnel to show where it was. Grant pointed his hand light up into the funnel and gave it to me. I saw the letters AT painted on the side in yellow paint. We ascended into the funnel. When it widened out, I swam to the surface myself and gulped huge breaths of air when I got there. I still felt woozy when I swam over to the side to climb out. Grant was already out of his gear. That was fast. He came running over, yelling, "Are you okay? Where were you?" When I gave him back the hand light, he just looked at me. "Where did that come from?" he asked, as if he didn't know. I looked towards the doorway. Grant was staring at me, white as a sheet. "Randy, I hate to tell you this, but both my regulators were bad. I never went back into the water. When you didn't follow me back, I just waited for you at the side of the sinkhole. I was about to call 911 when you surfaced. You came up alone, Randy. No one else came up with you, and I have no idea where that hand light came from. It's not mine. It was so corroded it didn't even work when I tried it." Now it was my turn to be startled. "How can that be? You saved my life, sharing your air when mine ran out and guiding me out of there with the hand light. I never would have made it without you." Grant just shook his head. "It wasn't me, Randy. I was up at the lip of the sinkhole the whole time." "Well, if it wasn't you, who was it? And the hand light worked fine in the caves. What could AT stand for?" As soon as I spoke, we both knew the answer. We looked at each other and blurted together, "Arledge Turlow, frog." That explained my rescuer's strong kicking. The doctor just shook his head and turned to my wife. "He's getting enough oxygen now. Don't worry. He'll be fine in a day or two." He walked out, leaving the three of us to stare at each other. Postscript. The body of Arledge Turlow has never been found. Weeks later, in the room near where my rescuer appeared, we did find an old set of air tanks, matched with Each tank had AT painted on one side in yellow paint, matching the letters on the handlight. The tanks were completely empty.